We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
Welcome to the Long-Term Investor. Last week, I had the pleasure of doing a live interview with Michael Kitces at Wealth Management Edge Conference. Michael's blog, Nerd's Eye View, is routinely recognized as a top resource for financial advisors, as he is one of the industry's go-to experts on all things financial advice and financial planning. In our conversation, we discussed the evolution of financial advice in wake of technological advancements, including AI. If you're a financial advisor or you use one, this conversation is full of great history and perspective. As always, you can find extremely detailed show notes and resources at thelongterminvestor.com. With that in mind, here is my conversation with Michael Kitces. Michael, welcome to the Long-Term Investor.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
Well, you've been a busy man today. We're here at Wealth Management Edge Conference in Hollywood, Florida. You have already spoken twice, and here we are in the podcast booth discussing the world around us yet again. And there's been a really common theme throughout the conference. You can't walk more than 5 feet without hearing the words AI at any point in time. And when I scheduled time for us to talk, I really did want to talk about the evolution of financial advice, the past, the present, the future. And I think it would be a shame to not incorporate AI at some point, but I would love just to start out with something I've heard you talk a lot about over the years, which just is that evolution of financial advice.
It fits well in context, and I guess we'll come to it in a bit, that if you look at the evolution of advice and advisors, like there's always been this interplay of what do advisors do and what can we do with ever increasing more powerful technology, for which like I really do just think about AI as another step in that progression as we just keep doing more technology things, right? It's like if I go all the way back, you go back to the start of it, I'll call like the modern era of the financial advisor, or you're back in like the 1960s, the 1970s, either we sell insurance or we're stockbrokers, like good old Wall Street stockbroker, which was actually really lucrative. Like back then, you could get paid as much as $200 a trade in like 1970s dollars to execute a stock trade. It's like $1,000 a trade right now. So only people with giant piles of money ever even bought stocks from a stockbroker. You had to be like rich enough to have a stockbroker. And stockbrokers would just like cold call you with tips because frankly, when you get paid $1,000 a trade, it's really quite lucrative to keep cold calling people with money and try to get them to buy the stock of the day. And like that was the business. Until this change happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, or sort of a double change. The first was part of the reason why stockbrokering was so lucrative back then is the rates were actually set by the regulators. The aftermath of the boom and the bust of the Great Depression, there was a whole bunch of basically like commission gouging during the run-up in 1929 and then the crash in the 1930s. No one paid attention to the stock trading commission when you thought it was going into the sky, and then no one paid attention to the stock trading commission when it was crashing to zero. So brokerage firms did some bad things. People paid more for trades than they should have. The regulatory response was, we're just going to set the rates by the regulators. Every brokerage firm has to charge the same thing. Completely eliminated commission gouging, completely eliminated innovation. Because there was no incentive for a brokerage firm to invest into making better technology or better systems to make stock trading cheaper, because you were legally barred from charging less than the competition. So eventually, like we decided this regulation has run its course. After several decades, it gets to the 1970s, stock trading commission is deregulated May 1st, 1975. And then a funny thing happened. So this entrepreneur in Northern California, right outside of what we now think of as Silicon Valley, decides he's going to use these newfangled things that are coming out called computers to see if he can disrupt financial advisors selling stocks by using computers instead. So a lot of them know him today. His name was Chuck Schwab. So Schwab was started as basically a technology startup in 1975, right after the deregulation of commissions, to use computers to disrupt the human financial advisor. Ameritrade also came in 1975. Scottrade came shortly thereafter. The predecessor, but ultimately became E-Trade, also started then. There was actually this whole boom of basically tech startups in the mid-1970s through the early 1980s that were basically trying to leverage the arrival of the computer to obliterate the human financial advisor. Why would you need an advisor? We can make this super efficient through technology. So the end point of it was basically the robots actually won. Stock trading costs fell by 90% in 20 years from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s because of all the benefits of technology. That's how we eventually got down to like $20 a trade by the late 90s, and then it went down further from there. But obviously, like, we're still here as financial advisors. So as it turned out, technology didn't actually kill the financial advisor. It just killed the business model at the time, which was like, I'll sell you stocks from my boiler room inventory, if you want to go back to the movies of the time. And we kind of moved up the value chain. We said, like, sure, you can use a discount broker with computers to buy a stock. I will find for you a great stock picker. And the whole industry went into the mutual fund business. So like mutual funds went from a tiny cottage industry to multi-trillion dollars in basically just the decade of the 1990s alone, because the financial advisor model was being eviscerated by technology and we had to reinvent a new one. And so we did. From the industry end, kind of built bigger and better firms. I would argue from the consumer end, added a lot more value. I mean, at the end of the day, helping you find a professionally managed mutual fund was a lot better than selling like the stock of the day that our company had to move from inventory that may or may not have been a terribly good stock. So like consumers benefit, industry builds bigger and better firms because of this technology catalyst. We're having like a great heyday. And then there's another technology wave because the internet shows up. And suddenly E-Trade's now running commercials like, why would you pay a financial advisor? You can buy and sell stocks and mutual funds from your crib. It's so easy a baby can do it, right? We may remember like the TV commercials of the time, the E-Trade, the infamous E-Trade baby, all built around like this. There's a new leap forward in technology. Why would you need a financial advisor? You can use the technology to buy all this stuff. And you could. I could buy it myself. I could read like Kiplinger Money Magazine that were giving me like top 5 mutual funds to buy on my online investment account if I wanted to go further. Well, now the internet is here. Morningstar.com, Yahoo Finance, big charts, like the companies of the era have shown up. And all of a sudden you don't need a financial advisor to get a mutual fund anymore. So once again, you get to one of these, the technology is disrupting the financial advisor, except of course, we are still here. We all do still have businesses. And so what happened instead is like the technology didn't kill the financial advisor. It forced another one of these shifts in the business model. Anybody can buy a mutual fund online thanks to the internet. I will create for you a diversified asset allocated portfolio. And we went into this whole like holistic portfolio management business. Once again, I would argue like added more value to consumers, created more of a value proposition, right? Like a whole diversified portfolio is a much better offering than just buying the hot mutual fund, which itself was much better than just selling the stock of the day. So we're moving up the value chain as advisors. Consumers are getting helped more. Consumers that don't want an advisor are just getting more and more technology to do it themselves online. And so we continue down this road. Then we got to another moment of this about 10 years ago. The robo-advisors show up. Why would you need a diversified asset allocated portfolio? You can just get a robo-advisor to do it at a fraction of what traditional financial advisors charge. And so once again, like we started seeing a shift. Advisory firms we increasingly now have been less investment management centric, more holistic wealth management. I mean, like you have dollars, it needs to land somewhere, it needs to be well tended. It's like that still tends to be part of it, but now we're also talking about financial planning and tax advice and estate planning, and retirement planning, and all these other areas. The advice is getting more holistic. We run a bunch of advisor research studies on our platform. We can literally see advisors are actually getting more comprehensive. Their plans are literally like more comprehensive than they were 5 and 10 years ago. Like we can see the shifts underway. This happens almost like clockwork every 10 to 20 years where technology takes some kind of jump forward. It's supposed to disrupt financial advisors, right? Going on the back, like, why need a financial advisor? We have Lotus 123 now. And every time it comes, it sort of plays out in 2 separate channels, because oversimplifying a little, like we can kind of segment just sort of people overall, like our human psyche mentality into 1 to 2 camps. There's some of us that like to do things ourselves, give me knowledge and access to tools, and I'm going to get in there and do my thing. Often because I'm good at it, sometimes it's just like I like it. I like playing with it. And a lot, when we get to the money domain in particular, there's a lot of people like they like managing their portfolio and watching their assets and stewarding their wealth and doing all that stuff. Then there's a segment on the other end that are essentially the delegator mentality. Like there are other things I would rather do in my life than spending hours and hours on the internet following my own investments or learning about retirement planning or trying to figure out what the heck the safe withdrawal rate is or whatever else. I would like to hire a professional, have them tell me what the heck the answer is, because I would rather spend my time with my family or kids or traveling or this other thing I'm really into or my hobbies or building my career, whatever it is. Like, we come to it from lots of different domains. Some of us want to do this stuff ourselves. And so every time the technology leaps forward, we get cool new toys to play with. And then there's a segment of us that would really rather delegate and spend our time doing other things. And so those folks keep seeking out advisors who deliver successively more valuable value propositions, because we still feel the pressure from the advisor. And you can't just repackage what the internet does or what technology does for more price. You got to add something in there of value. And we always do. Like, the model has evolved in that direction, I think ultimately very positively for consumers as well. We have to do a lot more to just justify our existence as advisors, but that means more value gets delivered to the delegators that want to delegate, and the do-it-yourselfers get cooler toys to play with in the technology realm. Thus, the technology marches forward. And that basically that's how it plays out every time we get these leaps forward in technology.
Well, and taking a very small detour away from the technology side of it, because you're mentioning how we are moving up the value chain and providing more and more value, it also requires better talent. And better talent requires dollars. It is hard to attract and retain very talented people. I also know at PlanCorp, we've been doing financial planning for a fee since 1983. So we're here in our 40th anniversary year. That's not that new for us. And we are now seeing our other competitors doing it.
Yep.
And as a result, we are giving our advisors behavioral training now as well. And as the cost of talent goes up, I'm kind of curious, do you feel like this current state where there is basically no barrier to entry to giving financial advice is going to have to change at some point, given what the value of advice has become?
I do think there are some shifts that will eventually come in the requirements of what it takes to become an advisor. The regulatory routes for advisors. The word financial advisor is not really regulated as such. Advisors are generally regulated by what they implement at the end of the advice process. So if I give you advice that also involves you implementing some insurance, I need an insurance license with the state insurance regulator. If I implement an investment that ultimately I get paid a commission on, I have to be registered with FINRA because that's the regulator for selling products. If I'm going to manage a portfolio for a fee, I have to be registered with the SEC or states to get paid a fee for investment advice. So we don't actually get paid for financial advisor per se. We get paid by what gets implemented at the end. And the challenge to that framework at sort of a meta level is what that means is we don't actually literally regulate advice. We regulate the sales of things that come at the end of advice. And the regulation of sales, just historically since basically forever, is not a terribly high bar, right? The essentials for regulation of sales, not even specific to advisors, but in almost any industry, basically comes down to one of two things. Do you know how to make sure that what you're selling is not blatantly inappropriate for someone? And do you understand the laws that apply to you when we say you're not supposed to sell things that are not blatantly inappropriate to people? So almost all of the regulation gets to some version of how do you understand your customer to not sell them things that are horribly inappropriate? And do you understand the legal rules that apply to you? And this absolutely exists in our financial advisor realm. Like, when you look at the actual licenses that you need to become an advisor, they are almost all product sales licenses that basically the only requirement is a couple-hour exam you take a few weeks to study for and a high school diploma, and the diploma is technically optional. There's basically no standard aside from an exam you spend a couple of hours on that most people can study for in a couple of weeks. That's it. And if you look at that exam, like, it literally requires you to know nothing about finances nor advice to have financial advisor on your business card. You need to understand the products that you sell and the regulatory laws that apply to people that sell those products. And so from a sales end, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, at some point, if people want to buy a thing, we don't need to make this more complex than it needs to be. Like, let them buy the thing and have someone sell it to them. If you start amping up too much regulation on salespeople, you just end out limiting people's access to the thing. Advice, though, to me is fundamentally different. Like, when you look at anything that traditionally sits in an advice realm, or like professions that give advice, right? Like law, medicine, accounting, we tend to have a higher bar for advice than product sales, because at some point people are actually putting their trust and confidence into the advice giver, whether it's a legal advice giver or a tax advice giver or a medical advice giver. And because the stakes are very high, as they are across those domains, you really kind of want people to be subject to some standard. Even though it is limiting, you increase costs, you reduce people's access to some extent by putting some barriers to entry in place. But we've generally found for most recognized and established professions, you do want some barriers of entry in place, because the alternative is bad stuff happens. And the whole nature of when you hire someone in a domain of expertise, it's almost impossible for the average consumer to know who's actually a good, credible provider, because if they're that expert in a thing that's that complex, you literally wouldn't have enough knowledge to know. You have to trust and believe that they're capable. So we try to vet to the extent that we can. But to me, I'm generally not a fan of high levels of regulation. I'm kind of an entrepreneurial sort and find regulation to be barriers. But there is a level of regulation that is just you do want some regulatory barriers to be there. And in the context of your question, because financial advice has come from product sales routes, almost all of it is still regulated under a product sales framework, which is a very, very low bar that I don't necessarily think was bad for product sales, but I think is very lightweight for advice. And so what's happening in practice is, if you know, firms like yours are trying to raise the bar for themselves. They're using it as a point of differentiation. We actually have advisors with credentials and degrees and have spent time studying this and have years of experience before we unleash them on you as the client. From the business end, not actually a bad way to differentiate. And a lot of firms are succeeding by saying no, we really have talented people and we invest into this. From the consumer end, this actually probably wouldn't be a bad area for regulation to maybe make that bar a little bit higher, though. I don't want a hospital to differentiate on our doctors actually went to medical school. That should not be how we differentiate. That should be an expectation when you're a doctor. Yet our challenge right now is you certainly don't need anything remotely close to a finance degree to actually be a financial advisor. And that to me is a little bit problematic from a meta level for the industry. So I do think that over time, we're going to find some pressure to push that regulatory bar up. Right now, the good firms just use that as a way to differentiate themselves.
I have no doubt that listeners of our conversation right now are thinking to themselves, well, if AI can pass a master's degree from any major university, then why do people have to actually go out and study this? Aren't they just going to be able to punch in questions, advisors who maybe aren't trained as well, or are people just going to bypass the advisor and go to a robot for advice? So since AI has been such a big topic here at the event, I'd love to get your perspective on how you see it having already influenced the arc and the evolution of financial advice, or how it might in the future.
First of all, at a high level, I'm a tech nerd at heart. I love my tech, I love playing with my tech. I'm bullish on tech in the way that tech plays out in positive ways. But I fundamentally don't think you're going to see any foreseeable future where AI is directly competing against financial advisors for the people who hire financial advisors. There's a couple of reasons for that. In at least the intermediate term, there's a phenomenon that I've taken to start calling the AI penalty. In what we actually expect from AI to be willing to follow it or trust it or adhere to it. So imagine for a moment, you got to get across town somewhere to a meeting. And there's this app out where you pull out your phone, you hit a button, and a car just shows up to take you where you want to go. Now, it's a pretty cool service. Does it very cost effectively. Most of us have used this, it's Uber, it's Lyft, and so forth. I love this. I just hit a button, person shows up to drive me where I want to go, and they do it at a pretty reasonable rate. So now imagine for a moment as you're walking up to the car to get into the car, you open the door and you look to the front seat to see if it's your driver, or the way we've all been trained if we use Uber and Lyft, except you look at the front seat, there's nobody there. It's a driverless car because AI. And so now the question becomes very proximately, would you get in this car? And if you actually just look at broad-based consumer data on this, the overwhelming majority of us do not get in that car. A few of us do. We're technology adopters, and this is super awesome. And you know who you are because you're always the one that has the cool new gadgets in your circle of family and friends. You get in the car. The rest of us do not. We're just not there. For, I think, a couple of different reasons. Part of it is just some of us outright have questions on the technology. Is it really there? Is it really there? Is it really that good? There's some weird effects that start coming from just the autonomy control dynamics. We as human beings do not like being in situations where we are not in control, especially when the stakes are high. You can hear it in the language. You can die in a car accident, but you get killed by a driverless car. Or like if I'm steering, the accident may happen. But if the driverless car was just steering to me, like that was like a third-party externality that killed me. And I do not want to lose that level of control. At least if I've got my hands on the wheel, I can try to save myself at the last minute. Now, at some point, the data will pretty unequivocally show the technology probably actually detects it better than we do. But still, I don't mind the car that has the little warning. I don't even mind the car that detects that someone in front of me is slowing down, so the car automatically hits the brake faster than I can hit the brake. But I don't want to just sit as a passenger in a car that has no driver. It just starts wigging us out. And what that means from a practical perspective is most of us are probably not going to trust the car until it is not just as good as people, it actually has to be exponentially better than people. So much so that we are willing to surrender autonomy and control in exchange for that dynamic. And that's a really high bar that even as much as AI is compounding in cool ways, I'm not so sure how close we are. Even when we get there, we get to another problem, which is, okay, when the technology gets there, we're not just going to get into an AI driverless car. We're going to have a choice from 17 different AI driverless cars. And then you have to figure out which one is actually good and safe. 16 of them might be good. The 17th will still kill you. Are you sure the one you're going to get into is not the 17th? What have you done to determine this? Have you vetted it? Have you analyzed it? Like, are you really confident that you're getting into the safe driverless car? So now you go right back to where we were. Tech-savvy do-it-yourselfers are going to be like, I have analyzed all 17 cars. I have a spreadsheet of them, and I've read all of them in the math. These 3 are the best. These other like 14 or 13 are okay. This one's like the death trap you never want to get in. And then like some of us will feed off of those people who are our friends who just tell me which one's the good one because I want to figure this out on the internet. But most of the rest of us just come back to like, I'm not putting my life on the line to figure out which of the things is actually safe. I'm just going to get behind the wheel and drive it myself, or I'm just going to like hire a chauffeur that I trust and have them drive me around. And I'm right back to the fact that I still want the Uber with the human driver because I don't even want to have to take the time to figure out which of the 16 driverless cars are safe and the 17th one that's a death trap. I'd rather just have another human being because failing anything else, the fact that the driver doesn't want to kill themselves is a pretty good check safe on me that we're going to be safe in this car as well because their self-preservation is my self-preservation. And so there comes back to this point where it's still actually easier and more comforting to find a human that's just in this with me than it is to have to figure out which technology is safe and which is not. And again, when you get to kind of a split of mentalities, the do-it-yourselfers are going to figure out what technology to use to do it, but the reality is they pretty much wanted to use the technology anyways. And everybody else, basically like the people who tend to delegate and hire advisors, tend to still find, yeah, I'd actually rather just find an advisor and have them do this for me than have to figure it out on a continuous ongoing basis, which is why desktop computers didn't knock advisors out, the internet didn't knock advisors out, robo-advisors didn't knock advisors out. Every single one of those is the same thing. There's this big leap forward in technology that can do all this stuff, but you have to figure out which is the right technology tool or platform or website or computer vendor or whatever it is to use. And the people who like doing that just keep playing with the new fancy tools, and more power to them. But those of us that like to have someone else figure this stuff out for us tend to still come right back to the same place. And so that's why I say those of us who don't want to have to figure all that stuff out for ourselves, and like, can I just hire someone to get this figured out for me? As advisors, like we're going to get hired to figure out what's the right AI tool to help you do your financial plan analysis. We don't get replaced by people who use AI tools to do their financial planning analysis. There will be tools that do financial planning analysis. They'll get used by do-it-yourselfers who were never going to pay anybody to do it anyways because they like using the latest tools and gadgets to do it themselves. And so to me, like once you recognize that split, it essentially means both can coexist. The technology will get better and a whole lot of people will use it. And financial advisors will get to leverage the technology and a whole bunch of people will keep using them because different people are ultimately trying to solve for different things. When you want to just solve the math, you go find a tool, a calculator to do it, and AI will have neat tools. But when you're trying to figure out who to trust and which is the right thing to trust, what are the consequences if I pick the wrong thing? At some point, having a person who's an expert in picking the things, who also has some skin in the game with you to pick the thing, just starts to feel better. That's why I like getting in the car with the driver, because failing anything else, their self-preservation is my self-preservation. And this is kind of positive for me in the environment. And so that dynamic, I think, is ultimately why I'm not terribly worried about AI like disrupting and replacing financial advisors. And that's even before, as you said, like there's a whole other behavioral dynamic that goes with this as well. But just from the purest sense, like, you got to figure out who or what to trust. And you got to have some faith that they're going to stay aligned to you. And the human-to-human interaction is particularly good at that for people who like those interactions.
I think personally that I would not get in the car unless it were a very short drive in a very well-defined street. But I don't rule out the possibility that eventually I'll be comfortable getting in that driverless car. I also, as you were speaking, started to think about, would I go to a robot doctor with a medical issue? And maybe eventually I would, and maybe our children or their children would. At this point in stage, it's just hard to make that mental leap for the current group of investors.
Well, and look, it's not a fixed space that doesn't change. The space evolves unto itself. If I go 1 or 2 leaps back, I can't imagine today going to a financial advisor who refuses to use the internet. At some point, it's been incorporated in. We all use it. And like, no, I don't literally go to my financial advisor to open an account somewhere. Like, if I just want to open an account, technology actually solved this for me. Now, 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, like, I actually needed a financial advisor to open an account. I mean, unless you went to one of a very, very small number of direct-to-consumer mutual fund families like T. Rowe and Vanguard in the early days, it was basically impossible to get a mutual fund. If a financial advisor did not sell it to you, you literally couldn't get to it. Now today, like, if I just need a mutual fund, I don't even hire a financial advisor, nor does any financial advisor sell their value propositions like, I'll get you a mutual fund. The technology made that so easy that, yes, eventually the technology does get to the point where if that's all I want, I buy it for myself. But because it takes time to get there, the reality is by the time we get there, advisors don't even do that anymore either. They've let go of that. It's like, yes, why would you pay me for that? Like, spend 5 seconds doing it with technology. Let me tell you about all the other cool things that I do on top of that. And so when I look further out, it's like, sure, get your investment account open and have a cool AI thing, run a financial analysis to figure out whether you're on track for retirement. But here's the conversation I want to have with you. How'd you pick that for retirement? Like, you told me you want to retire at 65 with $1 million. AI is going to be able to do some lickety-split awesome analysis and mathematical optimizations to tell you all the right ways to align and figure out where to dial in your wealth to optimize your path to $1 million to 65. Like, totally cool. But Peter, like, just quick question before we turn on the AI tool to do that. Like, just wondering, why $1 million? That's a remarkably round number. Like, did you actually do the math and figure out you need exactly $1.00 million to make your retirement work from age 65 onwards? Or like, did we maybe kind of pluck that number out of thin air? Like, someone's like, yeah, I probably kind of plucked it out there. Like, it just seems like a big round number. It's like, cool. Well, if I could show you could retire safely at $800,000, would that be better? Yeah, like, then I could retire like 20% sooner. That sounds great. Peter, I mean, you have such deep expertise in your industry. I mean, I would bet in practice retirement for you, like, you don't even have to go cold turkey. I'll bet you could do some like part-time consulting back to the industry for like 5 or 10 years after you retire. And I mean, for way less than what you make today. If you could make another $20,000, $30,000 a year back to your prior industry for a period of 5 to 10 years, that's $100,000 or $200,000 of additional income. That means like you probably don't even need 800, you need like 600. And in fact, if you did that and you could even ramp the consulting income a little bit higher, like you probably only need 600 and you could retire at 60 instead of 65. Does that sound better? Like, oh my gosh, that's great. It's like, cool. So in like a 3-minute conversation, I got you from $1 million at 65 to $600,000 at age 60. That's not an AI mathematical optimization problem. That's helping me figure out what my goals actually are in the first place. And a lot of us don't actually know and aren't all that clear and often just need conversations to figure that out, which, yeah, you can sort of try to force like a little bit of an AI script to figure that out, but just human beings are kind of dynamic things. Sometimes we're even in our own denial a little bit about maybe what we really want or pursuing from time to time. And there's a certain power in human conversations to do that. Not even just to say like, yeah, humans boot tech, but just human being. Like, we are wired as social animals. We exist in herds. There's safety in herds. We want to be part of the herd to some extent. Like, we have to have some level of interaction with other people. We feel accountable to them in different ways. for all the amazing technology around weight loss. You actually look at all the research on weight loss and exercising. The greatest intervention for weight loss and exercising is not the coolest technology gadget. It's simply getting a buddy that you agree to go jogging with at 7 o'clock every morning, because you don't want to be that person that leaves your buddy standing on the corner not showing up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and your buddy doesn't want to be the person that leaves you standing on the corner not showing up to go jogging. And so the reality is, like, you can make all the technology and the rest. I can set the alarm, I can hit the snooze button, I can get my Fitbit and make it vibrate, I can turn it off. I'm not leaving my friend standing on the street corner. And so simple human-to-human accountability, it turns out, is like way more of a driver of actual change in our behaviors than any level of technology. And so it's those human dynamics where the human shows up that I think becomes powerful. And this idea that we can like self-discovery our ways there, I just don't think is realistic. I mean, the truth is we so struggle to like imagine a world different than the one that we already live in, that even as you look today, like the top articles now about AI are things like the 10 best prompts to enter into ChatGPT. We can't even figure out what to ask it. So the idea that it's going to be the great answering machine that solves everything in our financial lives, like, cool if you know what your problem is. But even the discovery process of like, what's the problem, what we're actually going after? I mean, in practice, like having done this with clients for a long time, these can be multi-hour conversations that recur over weeks or months or sometimes even years before we like re-attenuate where we are and what we even want to be doing in the first place. And so I think of it more like a super cool calculator. Yeah, when we want to mathematically optimize the heck out of this, I'm going to use a lot of technology to do that optimization analysis. But have we actually figured out what the right goals are, and are you taking the steps to do them, is so wired to just like our humanity of how we interact with other people that I have trouble seeing that go anywhere. And that's why like basically like the last 10 million X increases in computing power have not changed it. I mean, just if you look in the aggregate, think about where computers didn't exist 50 years ago and where we are today. My wrist has something more powerful than what we sent people to the moon with. Yet the advice business is actually booming and bigger than it ever was at any point in the past 50 years. So we're not only not being put out of business, we're actually building more value in advice off of the back of the technology. Because from the advisor end, it saves so much time, it actually lets us do more advice and be better for clients.
And that advice will continue to improve as technology and the toolboxes that we have at our disposal continue to improve. We have the guys from Animal Spirits waiting right outside the door. I would talk to you for hours more, Michael, but I appreciate you spending time with me here at Wealth Management Edge Conference.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
And for everybody listening, please subscribe, leave a comment on Apple or Spotify. I will have links to Michael's work where you can get even more of his perspective on these topics. You can visit thelongterminvestor.com. I will be sure to link all the information you find about Michael. Again, thank you, Michael. Appreciate you being here. And for all of you listening to Long-Term Investing.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.